The sea. Dark. Wide. Unknown. A small group of people, men, women, children, standing at the edge of the only world they had ever known. Behind them, Mecca. The city of their births. The streets where they grew up. The homes where their children took their first steps. Behind them also, chains. Humiliation. The burning desert sand pressed into the backs of the ones they loved. The sound of Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, whispering through cracked lips. The memory of Sumaya, may Allah be pleased with her, the first martyr, whose blood had already soaked into that earth. Before them, open water. A foreign land. A king they had never met. A language they barely knew. And yet, they stepped onto the boat. Because the Prophet, peace be upon him, had told them something. Something so simple. So certain. So full of trust in the mercy of God and the justice of human hearts, that it was enough. He said, "In Abyssinia there is a king under whom no one is wronged." Seerah ibn Hisham. No armies. No treaties. No political leverage. Just the word of one man about the character of another. And on the strength of that, they crossed the sea. Welcome to episode 4 of the Seerah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The first Hijrah. And the day a speech in a foreign court changed everything. Last week, we stood in the streets of Mecca and watched two of the most extraordinary moments in the early history of Islam. Hamza ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, the Lion of Allah, entering Islam in one fierce, love-driven afternoon. Striking Abu Jahl across the head with his bow. Standing over the most feared man in Mecca and declaring without hesitation, "I am upon his religion." And Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, the storm of Mecca, the man who picked up his sword to kill the Prophet, peace be upon him, walking into Dar al-Arqam and walking out weeping. The Shahada on his lips. The sword still at his side, but now in service of a completely different purpose. We saw the Muslims walk openly to the Kaaba for the first time. 2 rows. 2 lions at the front. A city that watched in stunned silence. And we left Mecca in that moment of fragile, newly found dignity. But the relief was not to last. Because the Quraysh, shaken, yes, were not finished. They regrouped. They increased the pressure. They tightened their grip. And the persecution that followed was so severe, so relentless, so crushing in its cruelty that the Prophet, peace be upon him, made a decision that no leader makes easily. He told the people he loved most in this world, "Leave." There is a moment in every great struggle, and in the lives of many people watching this right now, when endurance is no longer the answer. When the walls close in so completely that staying means being destroyed. The early Muslims had endured so much. Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, under the boulder. Sumaya, may Allah be pleased with her, under the blade. The family of Yasser, may Allah be pleased with him, tortured day after day in the open desert while the Prophet, peace be upon him, passed by with tears and a promise of paradise. They had endured mockery. Boycotts. Physical torture. Social isolation. The slow violence of being cut off from food and trade and family connection. And still, they held. But there are limits to what the human body and the human spirit can absorb. And by the 5th year of prophethood, those limits were being reached. The weakest and most vulnerable among the Muslims had no tribal protection. In a society built entirely on tribal loyalty, to have no tribe defend you was to have no defense at all. You could be beaten in the street. You could be starved. You could be killed. And the perpetrators would face no consequence. The Prophet, peace be upon him, who felt every blow absorbed by his companions as if it had landed on his own body, looked at the situation with the eyes of a leader who understood both the spiritual horizon and the practical reality before him. And he made a decision. Not a retreat. Not a defeat. A strategy. Go to Abyssinia. For there is a king there under whom no one is wronged. It is a land of truth. Stay there until Allah brings relief. Seerah ibn Hisham. This was not abandonment. This was wisdom. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was protecting the most vulnerable, the ones who could not survive what was coming, by sending them to safety. He was preserving the people who would carry this message forward. He was trusting that Allah's plan extended beyond the borders of Mecca. And he was right. The weight of leaving. I want you to feel what this moment meant, not just historically, but humanly. These were people leaving everything. Not for a holiday. Not for an adventure. Not because life had become inconvenient. They were leaving because staying meant death. They packed in secret. At night, in small groups. So the Quraysh would not intercept them before they reached the port. They moved through the darkness of Mecca. The same streets they had walked since childhood, knowing they might never walk them again. Some of them were pregnant, some carried infants, some were elderly. Some were still healing from wounds. And they walked, quietly, in the dark, toward the sea. If you have ever had to leave a place you loved, truly loved, you understand something of what that walk felt like. The way familiar things become unbearably precious the moment you know you are leaving them behind. The way the ground under your feet feels different when you know it is the last time. These were the first Muslim refugees. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, who could not go with them, stood in Mecca and watched them go, carrying his heart with them across the water. Part 2. Who were the first migrants? Clear, vivid, character-driven storytelling. The first group to make the Hijrah to Abyssinia was small. 12 men, 4 women. 15 souls. Carrying the future of a faith in their hands, let us meet some of them, because their names deserve to be known. Uthman ibn Affan, may Allah be pleased with him, and Ruqayyah, may Allah be pleased with her. Among the first to go was Uthman ibn Affan, may Allah be pleased with him. A man of extraordinary wealth, refinement, and nobility, who had left every material comfort behind for this faith. With him was his wife Ruqayyah, may Allah be pleased with her. The daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself. When news reached the Prophet, peace be upon him, that Uthman and Ruqayyah had safely arrived in Abyssinia, he is reported to have said, "They are the first to make Hijrah for the sake of Allah after Ibrahim and Lut, peace be upon them." Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, Ibn Kathir, the Prophet, peace be upon him, honoring them by placing them in the lineage of the earliest migrants for the sake of God. Can you feel the weight of that comparison? Jafar ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him. The voice that would silence a court. And then there was Jafar. Jafar ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, the cousin of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Ali's, may Allah be pleased with him, older brother. He was eloquent, deeply grounded in his faith. Physically striking and spiritually radiant in a way that people noticed when he entered a room. He did not yet know, as he boarded that vessel, that he was sailing toward the most important speech of his life. A speech that would be delivered before a king, in a language not his own. Under interrogation from the prophets, peace be upon him, bitterest enemies. And it would change everything. But we will get there. The others among the migrants were also companions whose names shine in the pages of Islamic history. Zubair ibn al-Awwam, may Allah be pleased with him, Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf, may Allah be pleased with him, and Abu Salama, may Allah be pleased with him, with his wife Salama, may Allah be pleased with her. A woman whose story of patience, loyalty, and eventual honor fills volumes of its own. 15 people. On a boat. Crossing toward the unknown. Carrying nothing but their faith and the word of their prophet, peace be upon him, that a just king awaited them. What they did not know, what none of them could have known, was that the Quraysh were already on their way to bring them back. Part 3, The Quraysh Follow. Almost cinematic thriller pacing. News travels fast in a world without walls. The Quraysh discovered the departure of the Muslims. And the reaction, the fury, was immediate and total. To the Quraysh, this was not just a political inconvenience. This was humiliation. Slaves and freedmen and young men and women, people over whom the Quraysh held complete power, had simply left. Without permission. Without apology. Without looking back. They had walked out of the cage. And the Quraysh could not allow it to stand. They assembled a delegation. 2 men, chosen specifically for this mission. Amr ibn al-As, one of the sharpest political minds in all of Arabia. A man of extraordinary intelligence, persuasion, and strategic calculation. And Abdullah ibn Abi Rabia, smooth, diplomatic, respected. Together, a formidable pair. They loaded gifts, expensive, carefully selected gifts, for the king, for his bishops, for his courtiers. The Quraysh understood power and how it moved through the channels of favor. They sailed to Abyssinia. And they arrived at the court of the Negus. The Christian king of Abyssinia, known in Arabic as Al-Najashi, with their gifts spread before them and their case prepared in advance. Their argument was simple, elegant. Almost impossible to counter, on the surface. They said to the Negus and his bishops, "O king, some foolish young men from our city have abandoned the religion of their ancestors, and adopted a new religion that is neither your religion nor ours. Their noble families have sent us to bring them back. They know best what is wrong with these people." Seerah ibn Hisham. The bishops, hearing this, leaned toward the Quraysh. "Hand them over," they advised the Negus. "Their own people know them best." And here, in this foreign court, the fate of the first Muslim migrants hung in the balance. The Quraysh had gifts, they had political cunning. They had the support of the bishops. The Muslims had nothing. Except the truth. And a man named Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him.
The recitation that made a king weep. Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him, recited from the beginning of Surah Maryam, the chapter of the Quran named for Mary, the mother of Jesus, peace be upon him. The story of Zachariah, peace be upon him, calling out to God in his old age, praying for a child. The story of Maryam, pure, chosen, honored above all women. The story of the birth of Isa, peace be upon him, Jesus, and his first miraculous words as an infant. And as the words fell into the silence of the court, the Negus wept. His bishops wept. Their beards, the narration tells us, became wet with tears. And the Negus picked up a small stick from the ground, and he said, "By Allah, the difference between what you have said about Jesus and what we believe is no more than the length of this stick." Seerah ibn Hisham. Then he looked at the Quraysh delegation, at their gifts. at their political maneuvering, at the careful trap they had laid. And he pushed their gifts back across the floor, and he said, "Go. They are under my protection, I will not hand them over." Amr ibn al-As, that brilliant, calculating mind, sat for a moment in silence. He had not expected this. He whispered to his companion, "Tomorrow I will return and I will say something that will destroy them." He returned the next day. He told the Negus, "These people say something terrible about Jesus, peace be upon him. Ask them." The Negus called the Muslims back. The companions looked at each other with fear. And Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him, stood again, and he said, simply, truthfully, without calculation, "We say about him what our Prophet, peace be upon him, brought, that he is the servant of Allah. And his messenger. And his word, which he cast into Maryam, may Allah be pleased with her. And a spirit from him, Seerah ibn Hisham." The Negus picked up the small stick again. And he said, "Jesus, peace be upon him, is not beyond what you have said, by even the length of this stick." He turned to his court. And he declared, "Whoever insults these people will be fined. They are safe in my land. I will not hand them over for a mountain of gold." The Quraysh delegation left, empty-handed, their gifts returned. Their plan destroyed, their political cunning outmatched, not by a general, not by an army, but by the words of the Quran and the honesty of one young man standing before a foreign king. And the Muslims of Abyssinia, far from Mecca, far from the Prophet, peace be upon him, far from everything familiar, were safe. For the first time in years, they were safe. Part 5, The Negus, a king unlike any other. Warm, reflective, philosophical tone. I want to pause on the Negus for a moment. Because this man, Ashama ibn Abjar, the Christian king of Abyssinia, deserves more than a footnote. He was not Muslim. He did not follow the Prophet, peace be upon him, openly. Though scholars debate the nature of his private faith and some narrations indicate he accepted Islam in his heart toward the end of his life. But what he did, in that court, on that day, was one of the most profound acts of human justice in the early history of Islam. He had every political reason to hand the Muslims over. The Quraysh were trading partners. Powerful neighbors. The gifts were valuable. The bishops were in agreement. The path of least resistance, the path that every pragmatic politician in history has taken, was to send them back. And he refused. He refused because he was a man who listened before he judged. A man who understood that power is not served by injustice, it is eventually destroyed by it. A man whose faith, whatever its form, had given him a compass that pointed towards something real. When the Negus eventually died, years later, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was in Medina. And the news reached him. And he did something he had never done for a non-Muslim ruler before or since. He led the prayer of absence, Salat al-Ghaib, for the Negus. He prayed for this man. This Christian king. Who had protected the Muslims when they had nothing. Who had given them safety when their own city wanted them dead. The Prophet, peace be upon him, never forgot a kindness. And he never let history forget it either. What this moment says about Islam. There is something in this story that I want to address directly, because in the world of 2026, it matters deeply. Islam, in its earliest, purest, most authentic expression, went to a Christian king for refuge. And that king gave it.
And the Prophet, peace be upon him, honored that king with prayer after his death. This is not a footnote. This is not an asterisk. This is the Seerah itself, teaching us that truth recognizes truth across every boundary of religion, tribe, and language. That justice is not the property of any single community. That the earliest Muslims, before there were Islamic states, before there were Muslim armies, before there were Islamic institutions of any kind, placed their lives in the hands of a just non-Muslim king. And he proved worthy of that trust. In an age of division, of us versus them, of every religion drawing its borders tighter and tighter, The story of the Negus is a reminder of what human dignity actually looks like when it is practiced rather than preached. The first group of migrants had found safety. But back in Mecca, the situation had not improved. It had worsened. And so, not long after the first group settled in Abyssinia, a second, larger wave of migrants made the crossing. This time, 83 men and approximately 19 women. A community in exile. Building a small Muslim world in a foreign land, praying together, raising children, holding on to the Quran in the absence of the Prophet, peace be upon him, receiving his guidance through messengers and letters when they could. And then, a rumor. A false rumor. One of the most consequential pieces of misinformation in the early history of Islam. Word reached the migrants in Abyssinia that the Quraysh of Mecca had accepted Islam. That the city had submitted. That it was safe to return. Can you imagine what that news felt like? Homesick, exhausted. Missing the Prophet, peace be upon him, with every breath. The news that they could go home, must have felt like water after years of thirst. Many of them turned back. They sailed toward Mecca. And as they approached, they discovered the truth. The rumor was false. The Quraysh had not submitted. The persecution was continuing. And now they faced a choice: turn back to Abyssinia, or try to enter Mecca under the protection of a tribal guarantor. The ache of that moment, sailing toward home and realizing home was still closed to them, is one of the quiet heartbreaks of the Seerah that rarely gets the attention it deserves. These were not warriors. They were families. And they were carrying the weight of exile with a grace that most of us will never be tested to match. This section should feel like a breath. Here is something I want you to think about. The Hijrah to Abyssinia is often treated as a side story in the Seerah, a brief paragraph between the more dramatic chapters of persecution and the later migration to Medina. But I think it is one of the most important chapters in the entire story. Because it teaches us something about what exile actually does to people, when those people are grounded in faith. The migrants to Abyssinia were cut off from the Prophet, peace be upon him. Cut off from the growing community in Mecca. Cut off from their homes, their families, their language, their landscape. They had every reason to fracture. To despair. To compromise their faith for comfort. They did none of these things. Instead, they built. They built a community in a foreign land. They learned to live with less. They learned to distinguish between what was essential and what was merely comfortable. They learned, perhaps more deeply than anyone still in Mecca could, what it meant to hold the truth when holding it costs you everything. And Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him, the man who stood before the Negus, spent years in Abyssinia. Years away from the Prophet, peace be upon him he loved. Years in a land where the call to prayer was not heard in the streets. And when he finally returned, years later, on the day of the conquest of Kaaba, the Prophet, peace be upon him, ran to him. Ran. And he embraced him. And he said, I do not know which makes me happier, the conquest of Kaaba or the arrival of Jafar. Sahih al-Bukhari. Years of separation, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, ran. This is who he was. This is the kind of love that built this ummah. Before we close, let us bring this home. Because this episode is not just about a boat crossing and a foreign court, it is about something deeply, urgently relevant to the life of every Muslim, and every human being, watching this right now. Lesson 1: Leaving is sometimes the bravest act of all. The first migrants did not run away from their faith. They ran with it. There are moments in life when staying in a toxic environment, a destructive situation, a spiritually suffocating place, is not endurance. It is self-destruction. The Prophet, peace be upon him, understood this. He gave his companions permission to leave. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away, with your values intact. Lesson 2. Justice has no religion. The Negus was not Muslim, and yet he was the protector of the earliest Muslim community outside of Mecca. The Prophet, peace be upon him, prayed for him after his death. This is Islam, recognizing goodness wherever it exists. In 2026, in a world that wants to divide humanity into neat, hostile categories, this story is a radical act of nuance. Honor justice wherever you find it. Lesson 3. The truth does not need to be defended by lies. Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him, stood before the Negus and said exactly what Islam taught about Jesus, peace be upon him, knowing it might cost him everything. He did not soften it. He did not reframe it for political convenience. He spoke the truth, plainly, respectfully, completely. And it worked. Because the truth, spoken with dignity, carries its own authority. Lesson 4. Exile refines what comfort cannot. The migrants to Abyssinia became some of the most spiritually rooted people in the early Muslim community, precisely because of what they endured. Your difficult seasons are not punishments. They are refinements. What you are being built into during the hard times is something that the easy times could never have shaped. Lesson 5. The Prophet, peace be upon him, remembered everyone. He ran to Jafar, may Allah be pleased with him. He prayed for the Negus. He honored the family of Yasser, may Allah be pleased with him, with a promise of paradise in the heat of their torture. No one who suffered for this faith was forgotten by the man who sent them into it. And if the Prophet, peace be upon him, carrying the weight of an entire ummah, remembered every single soul, how much more certain can we be that Allah, who misses nothing, forgets no one? Hold on to that. Emotional climax. Total stillness, every word carries weight. I want you to come with me one more time. Close your eyes if you can. It is evening in Abyssinia. The sun is setting over a land that is not home, but has become safe. The children who crossed the sea, some of them born during the crossing, some who have known no other land than this, are playing in the fading light. The adults gather for prayer. They face the direction of Mecca, the city that cast them out, and they prostrate toward it anyway. Because that is what faith looks like at its most pure. It does not require comfort to function. It does not need safety to survive. It does not even need the presence of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to stay alive. It needs only one thing. A heart that chooses, every single day, to keep believing. And somewhere far away, in the city that expelled them, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is also in prostration. His forehead on the same earth that has absorbed his tears and his prayers since the first revelation. And in that prostration, he is thinking of them. Making dua for them. Counting the days until Allah brings them home. The sea between them is wide. But love, real love, does not know distance. And Allah, who sees both the prostration in Mecca and the prostration in Abyssinia, is closer to both of them than their own heartbeats. And when my servants ask you concerning me, indeed I am near. I respond to the invocation of the supplicant when he calls upon me. Surah Al-Baqarah. Very long pause. Near, always near. Even across an ocean. Even in exile. Even when home feels like it will never come. He is near. Episode Summary. Today, together, we crossed a sea. We walked with the first Muslim migrants as they left Mecca in the dark, carrying their faith and nothing else, toward a land and a king they had never known. We stood in the court of the Negus as Jafar ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, rose to his feet, surrounded by enemies, far from home, and spoke the truth so clearly that a Christian king wept. We watched the Quraysh leave empty-handed. We honored the Negus, whose justice the Prophet, peace be upon him, honored with prayer. And we sat, just for a moment, with a community in exile, facing Mecca in their evening prayer, choosing faith over comfort, again and again and again. In our next episode, we return to Mecca. And we enter one of the darkest chapters of the entire Seerah. The year of grief. The Prophet, peace be upon him, would lose, within weeks of each other, the two people who had been his greatest protections in this world. His uncle Abu Talib, the man whose tribal shield had kept the Quraysh from crossing the final line. And Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her. The first Muslim. The pillar. The love of his life. Gone. Both of them. Gone. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, alone as he had never been alone before, would keep walking. That episode will break your heart. And then, it will rebuild it. If this episode gave you something today, share it, not for the channel. Not for the numbers. But because someone in your life might be in their own Abyssinia right now. Far from home, in a place they never expected to be, wondering if they will ever find safety again. Tell them, the Negus is out there. Justice finds people who keep moving. And Allah is closer than the ocean is wide. Until next time.